to all those who devoted their lives to aviation. The Wings of Russia studio presents. Wings of Russia documentary. The end of October 1968 was foul. Low clouds stood over the testing aerodrome of Zhukovsky. Phone calls kept coming from the ministry. The aircraft must take off before the new year. It was no accident. It was not just another new aircraft. It was supposed to be the debut of the supersonic airliner TU-144. The Anglo-French Concord was getting ready for its first flight at the same time. It was important to be the first. Prestige of the Soviet state was at stake. On December 31, the last day of the year, TU-144 took off. It was that aircraft which entered the history as the first in the world supersonic airliner. Civil aviation was in transition to a new quality level. Civil aircraft, wings over continents. With Nikita Khrushchev coming to power in mid-50s, the huge country started to change quickly. People began to move, creating demand for a lot of airplanes. Their mass use brought prices for air tickets down, making flights more accessible. It soon became clear that the drastic passenger growth cannot be satisfied by aircraft with piston engines. Aircraft with greater capacity and higher speed were in demand. Such tasks could be resolved by bringing jet aircraft into the civil aviation. Military aircraft were long ago flying on jet engines. That's why the new passenger aircraft was designed in Andrei Tupolev Design Bureau on the basis of a jet bomber. TU-144 became the symbol of the Soviet Union's progress. First Sputnik and the flight of Gagarin would be later on, but then in 1956, shown to the West, TU-144 produced a real sensation. Nobody expected such technical breakthrough from the Russians. The aircraft cruise speed was 800 kilometers per hour, flight altitude was 10,000 meters, 50 passengers on board. Practically all parameters of TU-144 several times exceeded its piston engine predecessors. Passenger jet aircraft Moscow, Omsk, Irkutsk flights were open. Having taken 50 passengers on board at 3:25, TU-144 heads toward east. Aircraft is piloted by Yevgeny Barabash. The aircraft is flying toward the sun. After 2 hours of flight, it is morning already and stewardess serves breakfast. Svetlana feels no worse than on the ground, and not only her. The comfort level was unprecedented. The bumpy air on a jet aircraft were not that tiresome as on light piston engine planes. TU-144 was decided to be put on export, but there was a minor problem. It was deemed in the West that for the purposes of safety, a passenger aircraft had to have at least 4 engines. The Soviet airliner had only 2. Then Tupolev issued a 4-engine version. The aircraft was called TU-110. However, it was never exported. Neither it had any use in airfloat since it had no advantages over Tu-104. The jet equipment promising economic advantages required significant investments into the ground infrastructure development, aerodromes, means of navigation and servicing. That was no one-day task. The takeoff and landing strips, as a rule, were not so long, so Tu-104 was equipped with the brake parachute. But even then, Tu-104 could not land anywhere, only where there was a concrete landing strip. The top quality skill for pilots was a landing without the brake parachute. Airports in large cities required reconstruction, not to mention minor towns with mostly sand aerodromes. But new aircraft were needed there as well. The aircraft for middle and short-range flights was created in Oleg Antonov's design bureau. In March 1957, AN-10, as the new airliner was called, made its first flight. The Ukraine sign on the sideboard spoke for itself, as the Antonov Design Bureau was located in Kiev. A straight, powerful, high-lift wing, a strong landing gear, everything in this airliner was made for frequent takeoffs and landings on and from short sand strips. Such merciless exploitation gave warning later on, but in the meantime everything went fine. Aeroflot kept counting millions of passengers traveling on the new aircraft. This was thanks to its large capacity, 132 passengers. AN-10 power plant deserves special attention. It was a novelty for its time. Turboprop engines are close relatives to turbojet engines. In a turbojet, thrust is created by the gases thrown from the nozzle. In a turboprop, the main power is transferred from the turbine to propeller, which creates the thrust. Antonov's choice of a turboprop engine for its airliner was no accident. Already at the design stage, such engine was thought to be more applicable for a passenger aircraft due to its cost efficiency. Advantages were known long before, while the deficiencies were discovered after the first test. Due to its complexity, the engine turned out to be less reliable. Later designers managed to cope with it, but in the meantime, new engines brought one problem after another. Exactly the same kind of problems Sergei Ilyushin experienced when he created his turboprop Il-18. This aircraft was needed for long-range flights. What was important, Ilyushin's aircraft differed by one idea which was principal for the Soviet aircraft industry. The designer was aimed at making a pure passenger aircraft with no unification with any military designation. This reduced the airframe weight and was most positive for the aircraft's operating cost efficiency. There were almost no such precedents before. Tu-104 is known to be born from a bomber. AN-10 was made in a pair with the military transport AN-12. Ilyushin's persistence with which he promoted his idea was awarded. He made an aircraft. Il-18 carried more passengers than Tu-104 and could carry them at a longer distance. It was slower than the Tupolev's airliner, but thanks to the straight wing, it could land on shorter strips. The Il-18 airliner took off from the Sverdlovsk aerodrome and headed toward Moscow. The aircraft is piloted by Lyubov Ulanova, the first in the country woman commander of a turboprop airliner. The beautiful aircraft quickly became popular in both domestic and international flights. Il-18 was actively traded abroad. It was then that the first experience in processing technical documentation under international standards was obtained. The Il-18 basic construction was used for a large number of modifications applied in various spheres. For example, it carried cargoes for the Soviet Antarctic scientific stations. Its flight range was, above all, provided by the turboprop engine. Tupolev's choice was clear. His intercontinental airliner was equipped with the same type of engines. We mean TU-144, which was supposed to connect not only the faraway points of the country, but different continents. Succession to the Tu-95 strategic bomber construction allowed to reduce the term of the passenger aircraft creation. But this did not mean absence of problems. For instance, construction of large diameter fuselage is a great technical problem even today, not to say of those times. Engineers had to think a lot over durability of such a gigantic fuselage, its pressure control, and the air conditioning system of such a great volume. While all of those tasks were being resolved, Nikita Khrushchev could not help waiting for a super long-range aircraft for his visits, and he was provided with 2 refurbished Tu-95 bombers. This version, identified as Tu-116, had a comfortable pressurized cabin for 20 people. Very soon, Tu-114 was ready. Its first flight was performed in autumn 1957. The crew of that flight was headed by Alexei Yakimov. Less than within a year, the aircraft was introduced in Brussels at the worldwide exhibition. Tu-114, the pride of the Soviet state, received the highest award. As of that date, it was the biggest airliner in the world. So when the US President Eisenhower invited Khrushchev to visit the USA, the Soviet leader could not withstand temptation to fly to America on a new aircraft. Tu-114 by that time had not passed all of the tests, and still Khrushchev flew. On September 15, 1959, Tu-114 brought the Soviet state delegation to Washington, D.C. The aircraft could hardly turn around on the local taxiways. Americans failed to have the high enough ladder to fit the giant. No doubt the effect was reached. Everyone in the USA and in the entire world was fascinated by the USSR's success in the creation of passenger aircraft. The powerful potential of the aircraft was proved by the roar of its mighty turboprop engines. They provided for the high flight characteristics of the intercontinental airliner. Absolutely unique for the Soviet aviation was the fact that the cabin of the Tu-114 early versions had 3 classes of comfort. Tu-114 could take up to 170 passengers and carry them at 750 kilometers per hour with a range of 8,000 kilometers. The high-speed Tu-114 turboprop airliner started its first direct flight to Khabarovsk. No one can get from Moscow to the Far East in a direct flight. 6 hours later, the aircraft passes the Baikal Lake. Pilot Soldatov and his crew perfectly performed the flight. Tu-114 is landing at Khabarovsk. The date of the first flight, April 24, 1961, surprisingly almost coincided with the date of the man's first flight into space. Besides long-range internal flights, Tu-114 soon mastered international routes. Regular flights were performed to Cuba, Canada, Japan. Entering air routes, new generation aircraft were immediately becoming a special pride. Beautiful profiles of the Soviet airliners appeared in almost every newly issued feature film. It was a romantic period of civil aviation, its golden era. Unprecedented comfort on board. Speed. 2 hours and you are at the Black Sea. Aircraft were made in an atmosphere of creativity and enthusiasm. Dozens of world records were set. Unprecedented measures for the national aviation development were undertaken to achieve the relevant level of flight safety. All new aircraft were thoroughly tested in various situations: switching off engines, flying into the center of a storm, or intentionally creating heavy icing. The destiny of the first jet aircraft generation was different. A monument in the Vnukovo airport of Moscow was opened to the first national jet passenger airliner. The gala ceremony was attended by veterans of the Soviet airlines. TU-144 served until the end of the 70s, when it was substituted by modern aircraft. AN-10 flew until 1972. Intensive operations from sand airfields gave its warning. Fatigue cracks appeared in power elements. Several aircraft crushed. After another disastrous flight accident, the entire AN-10 fleet was suspended from regular flights. The most mass and cost-efficient airfloat machine, Il-18, started its service in 1959. Some of its samples still fly. TU-114, with its highest reliability, was the flagship of Airfloat for many years. The 60s were the years of the turboprop and turbojet engines' impetuous development. They progressed mainly through improvement of their reliability and cost efficiency. All this preconditioned the appearance of a new passenger aircraft generation. Attention came to routes of minor length. Unexpectedly, the 50-seat AN-24 became very popular. In spite of its modest dimensions, it was covering 1/3 of the country's passenger turnover and therefore enjoyed mass production. Numerous orders for the turboprop AN-24 came from foreign air companies. The Tupolev Design Bureau made its own regional airliner. Unlike the Antonovs, this one was a turbojet aircraft identified as TU-124. The Tupolevs did not think too much and took the TU-104 layout as the basis, reducing its airframe by a quarter. However, TU-124 had a principal novelty. It was equipped with turbofan engines. They consumed significantly less fuel, which reduced transportation costs. Both aircraft were commissioned by Airfloat in the beginning of the 60s. With their appearance, capacity of the local airlines significantly increased. Besides, a task was set to create comfortable conditions for passengers. Unfortunately, the turboprop AN-24 produced even more noise than the piston engine machines. Certain measures were taken with TU-144 in this respect, but it was far from ideal either. The Tupolevs reached acceptable comfort on their next aircraft. Nikita Khrushchev was actively paying visits around the world. In 1960, in France, he got interested in Caravelle. Khrushchev, as an experienced air passenger, appreciated the low noise level inside the French airliner. Upon his return to Russia, he shared his views with Tupolev. Following its principle of spending minimum efforts, Andrei Tupolev took TU-124 as the basis, placing engines in the rear part like with the Caravelle, and got himself a new aircraft, TU-134. As to the noise level, it was really one of the most quiet aircraft. As compared to TU-124, its passenger capacity was increased by 1.5 times. This was achieved by reducing space between passenger seats. Such was the worldwide tendency. All air companies were struggling for the profitability of passenger transportation. Good morning. Are you going to Moscow too? I heard in Russia they have excellent orthopedy. Passengers were sitting like fish in a can, not only in TU-134. Practically all types of aircraft in service at that time underwent the relevant cabin readjustment. Thus, having slightly increased the TU-104 fuselage, the number of seats was doubled from 50 to 100. New aircraft were coming with dense rows from the beginning. Demand for air transportation services being way above the offer allowed to pay no attention to passengers' complaints. TU-134 was being produced for almost 20 years, and all that time the Tupolev Design Bureau continued to improve the aircraft. Versions with expanded passenger capacity, improved and upgraded onboard equipment, and new engines were coming into service. This airliner was the first Soviet aircraft certified abroad. A lot of these aircraft still fly today. In 2007, TU-134 marked its 40th anniversary since it started regular passenger flights. Not every aircraft can be proud of such a long life.
Внимание! Произвел посадку самолет аэрофлота, прибывший 910-м рейсом из Лондона.
TU-114 also performed long-range transportation, but it was clear that sooner or later they will get outdated. Thinking of a substitution, Aeroflot developed requirements for a new aircraft: more passengers, higher speed, and longer range. Since the Tupolev Design Bureau was overloaded with orders, creation of the new aircraft was assigned to Ilyushin. The aircraft was identified as Il-62. Just like at TU-134, engines were mounted in the rear. Low noise in long flights was very important for passengers. One can even take a sleep. The giant Il-62 is going to land right now. Look how short is the run of this huge aircraft after landing. Such a short run was provided for by the engine thrust reverser. It opens the thrust in the opposite direction, making the aircraft to slow down. Look, here is a demonstration how the reverse unit works. A 150-ton Il-62 is moving backwards. Il-62 is stable in flight like a rock, an English newspaper wrote. After a short run, Il-62 took off like a fighter, fascinated Italians wrote in Milan. The French left delightful comments having seen Il-62. Fantastic. Long live the Soviet people. A fabulous aircraft. Bravo. It's a perfection. In reality, it was not that ideal as the film of those years shows. Yes, the aircraft had good speed characteristics, but it was inferior to TU-114 in terms of range, while this factor remained a priority. Not only the country itself was enormous, Aeroflot's flight geography around the world expanded a lot. Starting from Moscow to Tokyo, pilots had to make a landing in Khabarovsk for refueling. Once again, engines caused problems. They consumed too much fuel. The problem was solved in 1974 when Il-62M entered into service with more economical engines. Plus, there was an additional fuel tank placed in the fin. After that, flights from Moscow to Japan became direct and commercial load became 1.5 times more. Aircraft of this class, due to their large dimensions, traditionally acquired the status of the Aeroflot flagships. Il-62 substituted TU-114 in this status. Jet aviation came to regional air routes in the second half of the 60s. Yak-40 became the first in the world jet passenger aircraft for such routes. This aircraft was very beautiful, like most of Alexander Yakovlev's machines, and its capabilities were outstanding. The extent of durability created by the aircraft designers enables it to take off and land on sand fields. It needs only 400 meters to take off. 3 engines gave it such power-to-weight ratio that it could well be used at high mountain aerodromes and in high-temperatures conditions. And if you turn 2 out of 3 engines off, the aircraft can fly without losing altitude on just 1 engine. The Soviet Union made unprecedented steps to market Yak-40 worldwide. This aircraft made a tour around the world through all 5 continents. The efforts were not in vain. Over 100 Yak-40 were exported to almost 20 countries of the world. In July 1964, the Chief Directorate of Civil Aviation was reorganized into the Ministry of Civil Aviation. General Yevgeny Loginov was appointed the first Minister of Civil Aviation. A military appointed to head a civil organization was not accidental. In the conditions of the Cold War, all civil fleet was potentially subordinated to the Ministry of Defense. All passenger aircraft were created with the possible quick transformation into military transport versions. Even the tests until the 60s were conducted by the Research Institute of the Air Force. Such dual designation had a negative impact on the cost efficiency of passenger aircraft. However, when 2 world systems were divided by the Iron Curtain, the Soviet airliners had nothing to compete with. In 1967, Civil Aviation Institute developed classification of the aircraft fleet. The already existing system was actually fixed. All aircraft were divided into 2 major classes, airliners and regional aircraft. In turn, airliners were divided into long, middle, and close range, while regional aircraft were divided into heavy, medium, and light. In the preceding years, the airliners' fleet was significantly renewed. while substitution of AN-2, the most mass regional aircraft, was required. The first attempt was made by Oleg Antonov in the end of the 50s, when he designed AN-14. This little aircraft, called the B, needed just 100 meters for takeoff and landing. 10 years after, the AN-2 substitution task was back again. This time there was a real competition between the Beriyev's BE-30 and the Czech L-410 aircraft. The Beriyev Design Bureau, specializing in military hydro aircraft, picked up a civil topic for the first time. The 14-seat BE-30 became rather simple in servicing and piloting. Its commissioning was expected after the tests. However, big politics stepped in. In 1968, in order to support aviation industry of the socialist Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union made an order for L-410. Beriyev tried to break the situation by improving its aircraft, but it did not work. Antonov came up with a proposal as well. Having significantly refurbished the layout of the B, he made a new aircraft, AN-28. However, by that time the decision to introduce the Czech L-410 was already final. Nevertheless, it failed to oust the undemanding AN-2 from regional airlines. Requirements to the new middle-range airliner were formed in 1963. The flight characteristics of the new aircraft were supposed to combine the takeoff and landing features of AN-10, the speed of TU-144, and the range of IL-18. The new aircraft was finally supposed to oust those three machines. The project was started in the Tupolev Design Bureau. The aircraft was identified as TU-154. According to designers' tradition, the number ended in a lucky 4. For the first time, this design bureau developed a civil aircraft not on the basis of a military machine, but from scratch. From the cost efficiency point of view, an aircraft of this class had to have 2 engines. From the point of view of safety, it had to have 4. The Tupolevs chose the compromising 3 engines variant. The layout was unique. Such was the American Boeing 727 and the British Trident. TU-154 radically differed from other Soviet passenger airliners. None of them had such a powerful high lift. Slats, triple-slotted flaps, spoilers. The wing represented the most sophisticated construction.
Эксперимент начался.
The test has started. The wing of this modern aircraft is equipped with numerous elements. How such high-lift wing will interact with the airstream. A wind tunnel test will help determining the most efficient form and elements of the wing. The airliner's regular service started in February 1972 and was dedicated to the Airflot's anniversary. By the end of the 70s, this airliner was produced in such a quantity that it became an image of the national aviation. By that time, the world was hit by energy crisis. Fuel prices went drastically up. Fuel efficiency became the main requirement for all civil aircraft. TU-154 was upgraded in this respect as well. With new engines, it not only got its new definition TU-154M, but its flight career continued. Having lived through all the historic thresholds together with its country, in the beginning of the new century, TU-154 remains the most widely used national aircraft. The supersonic TU-144 passenger aircraft deserves a special story. The Soviet leadership insisted on producing such an aircraft. Nobody counted the costs. It was not just an aircraft, but another symbol of progressing socialism. On the eve of 1969, some 2 months ahead of the Anglo-French Concord, the crew of Edouard Yelian took the TU-144 prototype into the sky. Tests started. Half a year later, the aircraft exceeded the speed of the sound. A year after, the double sonic speed was reached, and on July 15, 1970, the aircraft arrived at its maximum speed of 2,443 kilometers per hour. Upon results of the tests, the layout of the second copy of the aircraft underwent so many changes that it became a completely new aircraft. The outlook changed radically. The wing, the landing gear, the engine's arrangement, everything was different. Folding wings appeared in the front part of the fuselage, facilitating the aircraft balance at takeoff and landing. Such TU-144 was attended to flights in July 1971. Tests started from the beginning. The volume of free developments was enormous, but the aircraft designers believed in success. TU-144 flies day and night. It is easy and comfortable in control. This has been checked and proved. There is an onboard computer, automatic units helping not only to keep the course, but to choose the optimum cruising altitude and landing mode. However, the catastrophe occurred in summer of 1973 at Le Bourget kicked the program off the schedule. But the schedule was never suspended. The country's leadership ordered to put the aircraft in service. While there was another great problem to be resolved. The aircraft's engines, due to their excessive fuel consumption, did not provide for the assigned flight range. Initially, TU-144 was being prepared to fly from Moscow to Khabarovsk. Instead, a shorter route to Almaty was chosen. After operating tests when TU-144 was carrying cargoes and mail, the day of the first passenger flight came. It was set on November 1, 1977, on the eve of the Jubilee of the October Revolution. From that time on, the supersonic 150-seat airliner was flying to the capital of Kazakhstan. The airfare was slightly higher than the average. Tests continued with respect to the third variant of the aircraft with new, more efficient engines. One of such flights ended up in a heavy accident. It was the end of the supersonic passenger airliner's career. Tests still continued for several years when in 1983 the program was finally closed. The most probable reason was the political and economic crisis of the socialist system, while the flight accident served as a formal cause. The Concord started their commercial flights in January 1976. Throughout, for more than 20 years, they transported over 4 million passengers. In the 80s, operations of those supersonic aircraft were stable and profitable. Concord was famous for its reliability, and only by the end of its career it was darkened by the only accident. Interesting to mention that the American Boeing company also performed calculations of a supersonic airliner. However, the topic was considered to be non-perspective and all the efforts were thrown to the creation of a wide-body aircraft. Already in the 60s, it became clear that the passenger stream would be such that traditional means of transportation would not cope with it. Boeing was one of the first to forecast this tendency and designed an aircraft capable of carrying from 300 to 400 passengers at once. That's how the famous Boeing 747 jumbo jet was born. Later on, other wide-body aircraft started to appear. A300, DC-10, TriStar. The Soviet Union did not stay apart from the worldwide tendency. In 1967, Aeroflot developed requirements for the wide-body aircraft. By that time, it was already possible to perform such a complicated technical task. The airliner development was assigned to Sergei Ilyushin's design bureau. At first, the engine's arrangement, as with Il-62, was being considered. Soon in drawings and then in metal, there appeared the mid-range Il-86, just as we know it today with the pylon-mounted engines. One of the main advantages of this aircraft created by the design group headed by Novozhilov is that the multi-seat fast airliner will not depend on the weather. The Airbus could carry 350 passengers, 3 times more than Il-18 and 5 times more than TU-144. Here it is in the air. Its flight tests have been started. Upon the end of the tests in December 1980, Il-86 was commissioned to regular passenger flights. The Airbus was heavier than other aircraft, so in order not to build new takeoff and landing strips, it was equipped with a powerful high lift and a multi-wheel landing gear. The fuselage had 2 levels, the lower for luggage and the upper for passengers. The exits were made in such a way that the airliner could deal without the aerodrome ladders. 350 passengers were located in several parts of the huge fuselage. It had 6 meters in diameter, just like 2 metro tunnels. After the tightness of other aircraft, the Il-86 cabin seemed like a cinema hall.
Объявляется посадка в самолет аэрофлота, вылетающий 431 рейсом Симферополь, Каир, Хартум. Пассажиров просят пройти на посадку в самолет, выход номер 10.
Creation of Il-86 coincided with the appointment of Boris Bugayev as Minister of Civil Aviation. He personally conducted conferences discussing perspectives of the new aircraft introduction. Soon it was decided to create an aircraft with a longer range on the basis of the successful Il-86. The long-range Il-96-300 was supposed to substitute Il-62. Despite its similarity with Il-86, it is a completely new aircraft. It has everything optimized to reach longer range. The supercritical wing with winglets, highly efficient engines with a fuel reserve making almost half of the gross weight. Fuel consumption is controlled by an automatic system. New alloys and composite materials are widely used in its construction. Special attention was devoted to operating reliability and safety. Control systems are dubbed many times. The airliner can transport 300 passengers at a distance of up to 11,000 kilometers. Il-96 entered services in 1993. Several aircraft of this type are included into the governmental unit servicing high-ranking officials. Il-96-400T is the last modification. It is an air truck with a payload of 92 tons. However, the new generation of passenger aircraft included not only wide-body airliners. Together with Il-86, Yak-42 was often seen in the sky. The story of this close-range aircraft started in the first half of the 70s. Its layout repeated the successful Yak-40 scheme. But with the bigger dimensions, the new aircraft had 3 engines in the rear and a straight wing. In the course of development, the wing was slightly swept. The aircraft became operational in 1980. However, 2 years later, flights were suspended due to a heavy accident. They were resumed within several years after all technical problems were resolved. Well, in the second half of the 80s, the Soviet Union was hit by the crisis which led to the country's collapse. This affected the destiny of the aircraft developed at that time. The Soviet Times' traditional and sole customer, the state, had no time to think of new aircraft. Neither they were needed by the numerous newly established air companies which intended to squeeze the last efforts from the old aircraft. Design bureaus had to find funds for their developments themselves. One of the last airliners of the Soviet times was the middle-range TU-204. It made its first flight on January 2, 1989. The airliner is peculiar for its low operational cost, low noise and low fuel consumption. In the 90s, it went into production, but its scale could not be compared with the past. In March 1990, Il-114 performed its first flight. It is designed to transport 60 passengers at local lines. Like with Tu-204, not many of these aircraft have been built. Another aircraft, the close-range Tu-334, was publicly shown at MAX in August 1995. This aircraft has been certified and is ready for production. The Antonov's Design Bureau, which found itself in the independent Ukraine, offered aircraft of its own. They are intended to be built in cooperation with Russia. The regional AN-140 can operate from unequipped aerodromes, while the close-range AN-148 supersedes all predecessors in its class from the point of view of efficiency. With the integration of Russia with the world society, the buyers have obtained the direct ability to compare aircraft of different producers. Such comparison was not in favor of the national aircraft. That's why Russian air companies, one after another, keep buying or leasing Western airliners. Today, almost the entire passenger aircraft market is divided by 2 giants, Boeing and Airbus. All the rest are simply watching their achievements. Here you see how Boeing 787 Dreamliner is shown to public. And here is the first passenger flight of Airbus 380, the Flying Elephant. Russia is out of the game, having lost its positions. No one thinks of any competition between the leading design bureaus inside the country. Following the European producer's example, an integrated structure has been established, the United Air Building Corporation. Flight tests of the Superjet aircraft started in 2008. It was developed in the Sukhoi Civil Aircraft Company. This regional airliner is designated for minor and middle-range routes and is made in compliance with the most advanced world technology. The hope is that this aircraft would find its demand in this country and abroad. The world-renowned trademark of Sukhoi provides such a chance.